Okay, welcome anyone watching to Mind the Gaps once again. Here with my good friend Darin. And so after I posted that first video, kind of talking about all these little things between us called relations that we so often take for granted, Darin reached out to me with an email. It started with the sentence that really lit me up, to play with the pun a little bit. He said, the fire that burns in your belly is speaking to the fire that burns in mine. And that's a little bit what we're going to talk about today is fire and the role that can play just in our lives and tuning us in to these in-betweens that are so integral but we often miss. So Darin, why don't you take it away, introduce yourself, and start telling us a little bit what you've been tuned into.
Yeah. Well, I'm Darin Bue, and Jake and I have become friends over a couple of years of shared practices. And yeah, I one of the things that I do that's kind of my passion as a retired person is that I've gotten involved in prescribed burning. I live in a fire adapted ecosystem that is very prone to fire, and I live on a piece of land that I've been here since 1993, and when I came to this place, it was so overgrown with brush that it felt like it might spontaneously combust at any moment. And there was such a huge volume of it that the only thing I could think of to do was to start cutting it and stacking it and burning it. And it really lent itself to that. So I worked on that for about 10 years and got a great, huge defensible space in this pine forest around my house that I live in. And in 2001, a major catastrophic wildfire came down the canyon. And when it got to my property, the fire suppression agencies they found a place to set up in the defensible space that I'd created, and they deflected this just really hot, crazy fire up away from my house. And I happen to be kind of the spearhead of the little village that I live in. And the fire was able to be deflected away from my house and away from the town. Um, and it was really a wake up call, because I realized that if I hadn't done that work, my house and likely the whole town would have been consumed by fire. And now, decades later, I'm surrounded by a beautiful stand of pine trees. And if you go just outside the boundary of that stand of pine trees, there's this sea of chaparral that has taken over, where all the trees were killed because the ladder fuels had not been removed from underneath. And there was just this wall of fuel from the ground, and the trees were 70, 80 feet tall. And that just went up. That was the best structure that you could imagine for a fire. And it just all went up, and yeah. So my property in the town, the property around the town has got a really nice stand of pine trees that survived that because of the fuel reduction work that I had done um, for a while before that fire got here. So that really got me to thinking about um, my relationship. I realized that I had developed a relationship with this land over a period of time, and that relationship had begun to reflect, my needs as well as the needs of certain components of that ecosystem. And as I engaged the landscape, I made space not only for myself, but for all the other large animals that need space. Deer have a hard time walking through overgrown forests. Bear, the big animals, um, have a hard time getting through all that. And there's nothing to eat. It all gets woody and old, and there's not much to eat. I was I spent a few days in Berkeley a while back, and the mountains around Berkeley are so overgrown. There's a lot good trail systems, but you can't really get off the trail because it's so thickly overgrown that it's just woody and dense and just terrible brambles. The deer that live in those mountains come down into Berkeley at night because the browse is far better in the concrete jungle than it is in the forest, which is ironic. Um, but I've done a bunch of research, and I realized that when Europeans landed on this continent, time after time they made a record of how open the forests were, and in fact, a lot of what we call the iconic forests, especially on the east, were grasslands. They weren't forests. There was lots of prairie and lots of grass back there. And it turns out that the people that were here when the Europeans got here kept that all managed, kept the weedy vegetation at bay using fire intentionally. And it provided for a landscape that was vibrant and invited the livelihood not just of humans but of all the different kinds of animals that humans used for game, and of course the plants that both the animals and the humans ate. So I've developed this vision of a landscape that was an ecosystem, a working ecosystem in which humans were a part of it. And it's gotten me thinking a lot about, how we view ourselves in the Western world in relation to the landscape and to each other. In fact, it seems more and more that we don't see ourselves as being related at all. It seems like we have an eye for, instead of the characteristics of the land and the characteristics of people, um, we look out for, what is it, mm, I'm blanking on a word. Um,
Utility.
the properties,
Mm.
we can be sensitive in relationships that are productive and that are vibrant and that are complex. It's an interaction of characteristics. And what the Europeans saw, for example, when they got here, was um, just a timeless relationship of lots of living things that was kind of stewarded by human beings. And they were fascinated, the Europeans were fascinated by the potent properties that they encountered. And they quickly began to think of ways to extract and harness those properties. And it turns out that it destroyed the relationships. It hampered the relationships between the characteristics of the different living things. So anyway, what attracted me to what you were talking about is that you were talking about, well, one of the things you said, Jake, was that there's a turn of philosophy, and and it's more toward relational, understanding things in terms of relationships. And it occurs to me that rather than something new, I think that might be the revival of something that is inherent in human beings. I think I have a suspicion that human beings have always been relational up until the Enlightenment, when certain really busy minds found ways to measure things and quantify things and name things and categorize things, and that became a fascination that kind of swept the consciousness of the planet, right? But I think that it maybe wasn't so much an advance in our intelligence as it was a narrowing, a narrowing to a particular aspect of our intelligence. And, working with fire, I realize there's skills involved, right? And those skills are not facts, right? They're a different kind of knowing.
Mm.
You know, and then, this perspective that I've gained on how fire adapted ecosystems thrive in the presence of fire. That's a perspective, right? It's not really a fact. It's a perspective on the relationships on the living landscape. And that's another way of knowing. It's not fact, you
Mm.
know. So I
Yeah.
think I, I have a
Well,
feeling that what that tendency toward that way of thinking, I think you call it thingness. We think of ourselves as things. We think of ourselves as things that have somehow been mysteriously placed on this thing we call the earth. And and it's not working for us. It really isn't working for us.
yeah, yeah. Oh man. Yeah. So thanks for laying all that out. I actually did not know the story of how your work with all the brush around your house actually pretty much saved your town and probably a good chunk of that forest. So that was really cool to hear you go through that. And it it adds, I knew you were really passionate about this work, but it really adds a layer of just reality about like actually what it meant for you and what it did for you. So thanks for sharing that. And I think you're spot on. I do think this is much more ancient. I don't think it's new. I think articulating it is new. I think I think this is how we live naturally. Because that was one of the points I made in the other video. It's like so many of the things that we seem to really care about, like meaning, like love, like friendship, like our connection with the world around us, they don't exist in the things. It's in the relations. It's in the relationships. And I think that was just obvious. That was just the things that mattered were like that. And I even look at how I can't even get out of it. The things that mattered, right? I
Right?
we're so
It's
stuck
in
in
our
this.
just in our language. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a big part of it. I think language does dispose itself to talking about things. It's kind of the idea of this podcast is to start to try to play with ways that we can kind of point in between, because that seems to be what's really needed. Because I think more and more people are actually in the same way that you have through, some through fire, some through dance or music, some through photography, some through whatever their thing is, are starting to actually grok this this relational aspect of reality that actually seems to be more important. And but we don't have good ways of talking about it with each other yet. And this is really an attempt to just intentionally give it a try, even if it's kind of tricky to navigate some of these waters.
Oh,
So
you said that.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
you said that the language kind of lends itself to this thingy way of thinking, and you talk about pointing, devices to point at the relationality, and you mentioned music, and I've imagined that, I mean, at some point not too distant past, we didn't write things down. We had, we spoke, we had rich language, maybe richer than we have now because it was the primary means of communication. And if I just let myself imagine how that evolved, I can go back to a time when maybe we just whistled and chirped at each other. We didn't speak in words. We just it was just no it was just sound, you know.
yeah.
But
Well, and there's this sense of it's it is more of a pointing, which is more relational because it's my finger doesn't mean the thing. It's what it's what it's pointed at. It's what it's in relationship to, and all of the sounds, we didn't, all of the proto words, or even most of words for a long time. You didn't have like a lockdown definition. You interpreted it through the relationship, and we still do that. That's still actually how we talk. We just don't. We have all these theories about how language works, and we have it all pinned down as these little things that are cut off from each other. And so I want to start playing with that symbol of fire to kind of use that as an inroad to put some language on this. Because one of the things when I listen to you talk about that is, you know, the this is gonna feel like a stretch. I know you're gonna be able to do this better than me, but I'm just gonna gesture in this direction. Is kind of how fire burns by relation. I'll start there. Like it only spreads because this thing is close enough to this thing that the fire can get across. And 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 there's something really obviously there's something really core to our humanity about fire. Like we sit around bonfires and we tell stories and we talk and 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 all of our metaphors for like the fire for life. You kind of burn, there's an excitement, and in dialogue we talk about this stuff where we're just talking and then something catches and now we're actually glowing and something's burning and takes on a life of its own. And I think that part, the life of its own part, the way that fire spreads, and it's not any point of it, but it is many, many relations. And when you're jamming again with music, when the jam takes on a life of its own, when I'm not making up the part, I'm listening to you and you're listening to me, and it's just kind of emerging between us. This life of its own quality that I at least perceive as, this feels like a stretch, but I like in some way in my heart I know it isn't, like is the kind of dance of relation between us.
Yeah. 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 And the other thing you mentioned when you talked about relationality, you kind of connected transformation, the idea of transformation to it. And there is nothing quite as transformational about that freight train of relationship that you're talking about with fire. It is the transformation of fuel to its chemical constituents, solid fuel
Mm,
to its chemical constituents. And that redistributes nutrients. It it um
mm,
it redistributes minerals and gases, and provides for a renewal, a renewed dance. It renews the dance of life on the landscape in fire adapted ecosystems. It provides the necessary renewal of the dance of life, and when it's removed, that dance gets more and more constricted. The life within it becomes less and less diverse. Um, there's a way that fire opens up what, in the 80s, the ecologists came up with the term trophic cascade, for these kind of relationships. There can be positive and negative trophic cascades, but the one that was really popular, the positive trophic cascade that was popularized, was when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone,
mm,
and that caused the elk to stop hunkering down next to the streams where they were vulnerable to the wolves, and that provided the all the stream life, the vegetation along the stream to become more robust, which supported the beavers, and the beavers began to
mm,
make dams, and the dams
mm,
backed up the water, and the water tables came up, the temperature of the water dropped, the bugs that hung out in the water began to feed the birds. There was just
mm,
this a cascade
mm,
tool that was created by reintroducing the wolves, right?
mm. Oh, and what really comes out for me if you talk about that is the livingness of it. Like there's no way that any scientist could have calculated that. Like they could have, maybe had statistics that it'd probably be a good thing to put wolves here. But it's not like you could track all of the implications, because in some sense they're infinite. Like they
Right.
really are. And that turn is something I like really want to zero in on, of okay, let's try to get an algorithm and calculate out all the relationships and figure out how it all works. But there's another way that, well, I'll call tentatively intuition, but I want to kind of enrich in that a little bit. Is like, you're talking about the natives who burned the land and all of these things, like, and how you were really a part of the ecosystem. Well, I'll speak my experience with trying to live more relationally, try to live more kind of from this place of relation first, and really beauty first, is not as much trying to calculate how would this be a good decision and then making it, but listening, well, listening to the cascade of relationships that is me. So that is every little thing in my body. Like, this is a lot of what we do in circling, right? Like listening for actually what comes up in my body, and not immediate and in my like moods and emotions, and listening to all these things and not trying to make sense of it all, not trying to calculate what each thing means, but just really opening myself to the richness of all of the information that's kind of available just in my experience, and letting that guide me, and as opposed to trying to calculate out what I should do. And the fruits of that have been, I mean, in the same way that introducing the wolves had effects that you could never have predicted, effects that I could never have predicted. And there's a greater the you mentioned this in the email too, like the analogy of surfing. Like I don't know what the wave's gonna do, but I can learn to attune to it, that I can port myself to it in a way that has this relationship of really being in tune to it. And there is an intelligence there. I'm making decisions, but it's way too fast that I can calculate anything. Like, it's a much more coupled, there's a coupling experience. And I'm hearing when you talk about really reestablishing this relationship with the environment, it's much more of a coupling. It's not calculating how we should interact with it. It's really finding ourselves to it in that way.
And the word faith comes to mind because there really is
Mm-hmm.
like an element of just having faith in being.
Mm-hmm.
And once we begin to have some faith in being, you know, I can imagine that, we lived on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years in pretty much the same, just like you and I are right now, right? Same brain, same physique, everything was just the same. So we've been tinkering around with being for longer than we can imagine. And at some point, our experience had to have reinforced our faith that that there was a sense of things that did make sense, and that, just having that faith opened our eyes to things we wouldn't have known before. So there was a knowing that wasn't, like you say, about measuring the properties and extracting the properties. It was about kind of being one and coupling with the character in which those properties were embedded. That's that's how I'm trying to picture. That's kind of the vision that I'm having about how we must have been on this planet before we got obsessed with the calculations of things.
Yeah. And you use this word character a couple times, and it seems to be pointing in a direction of things that I've kind of grokked with as well. And I'm just curious to hear you explicate a little bit more, like what's in that word character for you, because I kind of know my sense of it, but I'm curious that you've used it in this place that's like there's a lot of importance around it.
So yeah, it's like paying attention to, when I pay attention to my body, when I pay attention to just my being, and I allow the chatter in my mind to just back away a little bit, I begin to sense affect. So like, the people that I surround myself with, they have a character that
Mm,
seems to gel with my character.
mm,
And it's not fact, it's not something that I can measure, but it's something that I know, and it's something that they know. It's a
mm,
mutual knowing, you know.
mm,
So that's an example, I think, of character.
mhm,
Um, I live in a particular climate zone, um, and the winters are pretty cold. Gets to be a lot of snow, and that snow sits there all winter long, and then as it begins to melt in the spring, as things warm up, there's certain mold, and there's a certain mustiness to the air when that stuff melts. You can smell springtime, and there's a mustiness to the air. There's a sound. There's the birds and the squirrels and all the little plants are just chattering, and they're just everything's coming alive, and the whole place has an affect that just sweeps over me. And it's,
mm,
it's the character of this place. The
mhm,
my view shed is there is always some kind of landmark on the horizon that I can orient myself toward. So I have a really my sense of cardinal directions is always reinforced by the landmarks on my horizon. Um, and so all of those things, they kind of all speak to different sense gates, right? And they combine in this orchestra of sensations to speak to me in a character. There's a character of this place.
mm.
Yeah.
That's really well put. Yeah, yeah. So now I noticed listening, I have the desire to turn the dialogue a little more, um, I guess aspirationally. So it's like, what can we do to, I guess, sensitize ourselves to the character of things more?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's why I brought up fire, because I go out on these prescribed burns, and they're a volunteer jam. People just show up. So they're on private property, and all the neighbors show up, and we have a safety meeting at the beginning where everybody introduces themselves, talks about why they're there, what their interest in being there is, maybe a little bit of background about their experience, and we do a weather report. So we look at the humidity, the relative humidity of the air, because that's important. um, we check the humidity of the landscape. So we'll take a humidity reading on some sticks and shrubs and stuff, and see what kind of humidity is in the fuel. And we'll
Mm,
take a weather forecast, so we know how the weather is going to unfold during the day, because wind and fire are really dangerous. So we want to make sure that
mm,
we burn within a weather window that's safe and lends itself to good fire. And then we light a little test fire. We stand around and we light a little test fire, and just kind of stand around and get a sense of the character of the fire. What's this fire going to be like? Before we really start laying it down, we just kind of get a little tester, and we talk about it. We ask, you know, anybody that's got any kind of sense of it speaks up, says what they think, and then we just start rolling fire. And so the fire, the way we do what's called a backing fire. We burn into the wind, downhill and into the wind, so that the fire just creeps along, and it doesn't get fanned. So when fire burns upslope, it creates convection currents,
mm,
right? And even if there's no wind, it'll create its own convection current, and it'll go faster and hotter and faster and hotter as it goes up the hill.
mm,
So what we do is we start at the top, preferably with a slight breeze coming up the hill, and we run a backfire down the hill, and we get a strip of fire going, and we let it start creeping down the hill. And then we just kind of hang out and talk while it burns, and just enjoy the day, and check out the birds. And as it burns, like grasshoppers and bugs sometimes will fly out, and all of a sudden birds will show up to take advantage of that. And
Yeah. Quick, can I pause you for a second?
yeah, yeah.
I got really lit up by the almost ritual that kind of to prepare for doing the burn itself, because there was something that felt really important. Like, so earlier we were talking about, we used to have this relational way, and now we kind of have this calculating thing way. And yes, there's a contraction, but also I don't think it's there is also, obviously, we're on internet right now. We take advantage of a lot of the fruits of this calculated way. And I think what I heard in that was two things that I really want to speak to, is how there's an integration of this. Because like you said, we measure the humidity of sticks, we check the weather. It's like we measure things, but we don't put them into an algorithm to see what we're going to do. We put them into ourselves. Like, I really got that when you said you do the test fire and you all stand around it, and you kind of, you let all the information about the wind and the humidity, and you kind of know that in yourself, and you just get to be with the fire. And it's like, what comes up? What's the character of it in that way you were talking about? What do I kind of feel in relation to it? Like, I can even imagine asking, like, what name would you give the fire today? Like, what? And there's a much more affective sense of it than just putting all these numbers in a container. It's like you're actually running it, or in an algorithm, you're actually running it through yourself.
And that running it through ourselves begins to identify a character of the group. Every time you get a bunch of people together to burn, to go do a fire, you've got that group has a different character, and that
Yeah.
begins to come out. And
Oh,
it emerges over the course of the day, right? As different things come up, like sometimes, like the wind, as it goes across the landscape, the wind will do funny things. As it comes over a rise, you'll get a rotor, and sometimes the wind will actually burn uphill, right? So you'll be standing there, and all of a sudden a gust will come over the top of the ridge, and it'll create a rotor that comes back up the hill, and all of a sudden there's hot fire that's kind of coming up the hill in places where it hasn't burned, and everybody's kind of like, oh, check that, watch that, and so the thing is alive, and it changes, and everybody is aware of the fire, and they're aware of one another. Where are the hoses? Where's the water? Who's got what tool? Everybody brings different tools, and so when the situation evolves, the whole group, as a kind of a super organism, works to adapt to whatever it is that the fire is doing.
oh, I'm just getting really excited listening to this, because I'm really getting the image of the living ecosystem, of all the people with the fire, with the land, with the animals and the bugs and the birds, and the stakes, like you said. Like, I mean, obviously, fire is dangerous, and it can really do some damage, as we've seen, as you in California know plenty well. And so the part of what I'm tuning into as I listen to you is like, you know, I'm not trusting an algorithm with it. Like, we need the collective consciousness of a bunch of humans that are bound together, because that's the only that's the only way where you get enough collective wisdom to actually do something like a prescribed burn. Like, I need every person attuned to the environment in their own particular way, that each of them particularly kind of, maybe some person knows more about airflow, or some person knows more about this kind of grass, or whatever it is. Everyone's attuned in their own particular way. You're all attuned to each other in the sense of, like you said, knowing who has what tool, but also knowing the character of the group and who's reliable for what. And I imagine there's this sense of almost telepathy that will come out, where it's just, like when you see the basketball players, like, he doesn't even look and he just passes over there because he knows that guy is there. Like, there's this sense of just the group mind emerging.
Right. Well, and so little kids show up, a lot of times there's like toddlers on these fires, and there's little old ladies that are just kind of moving slow and they're a little bit hunched over, and everybody in between, right? So everybody's watching out for everybody. When the
Mm.
toddler starts getting a little crazy, people are like, hey.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah. I I there and so there's something about that that I like, you know, without getting too grandiose, but also let's get grandiose. Like there's something about that that I could start to imagine at like a much higher level. Like this is okay, organizing for a group to do a prescribed burn, but like could a theoretically could a whole city kind of have that degree of communion is really the word that's coming to mind, like of common union of we're fitted together in this way that we're fitted to each other, to ourselves, to the environment. And I don't want to immediately kind of jump to that scale, but I just want to start to feel into that. That's a way different way of organizing. um I know we said we didn't want to use too much jargon, but this one's pretty accessible, I think, is basically complicatedness versus complexity. And what I'm hearing here is a complex, like
Right.
living system. Or the complicated is some like a bureaucracy, right? It's like there's many prescribed steps and levels and they interact with each other in these ways. It's very complicated, but you could theoretically map it all out on paper, what fits into what. Where what you're talking about, it's not that kind of thing where there's an algorithms and calculations. There's a real living, you become a one living kind of organism in some way.
And as you mentioned, we've integrated what we've learned about measuring and calculating, and so the command control system that's used by law enforcement and the military and fire protection, it really works when there's a fire that's out of control and it's a crisis, right?
Mhm.
And it's really good to have that, right? But the way we can kind of steer away from needing that
Mhm.
is to do what you're talking about. It is to put fire back in the hands of people. you know
Mhm.
Create a situation where neighbors all understand fire. They understand the different. Not all fire is bad. Not all fires even dangerous. There's once a landscape has been prepped by the intention of being able to put regular low slow fire on it. That low slow fire is not dangerous as long as the people who are administering it understand that there's times to burn, there's times not to burn, there's places to light and places to stay away from. And once you get that knowledge becomes widespread in a community, then fire ties that community could tie that community together in a way that becomes a relationship that is catalyzed by the land,
Mhm.
an understanding of the land,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. Yeah, I am just really savory the kind of the vision you're putting forth here. And I what do I want to say? I mean, I my mind goes many different places with it. One is to get very esoteric almost and let it kind of fly out in all directions, which can be fun. But I there's something about the real groundedness of being able to talk about it in this way that you know it can be easy to talk about. Not that easy to talk about, but it can be tempting to try to talk about this idea of the group mind and the group ecosystem and this real much more character based level of connectedness in ways that can get really abstract. And there's something about how just immediately on the ground and present this is that I want to hold on to. And while plugging in, like, I guess, we talk a lot about dialogos, about conversations that take on a life of their own in a very similar way. And And that's deeply what I get, like when I hear what you're talking about. Like I'm sure there's some sense of of leadership in this, but it's not like you're giving command. It's like there's like the head and the body of the organism. It's not, it's not like as we well know, our head doesn't control our own body as much as we'd always like it to. So it's much more of a living thing. And where there's something that's alive for me in terms of wanting to draw out the ways I'll use this point that you made. The systems are really good when things get at a level that are higher than we can't attune to. Like, yeah, maybe your small group can attune to the level of your local fires, but like when a forest catches, like you want the system to come in. And like, yeah, maybe it would be ideal if we could have a group mind organism to deal with it at that level. But until we got that, the computers do a pretty good job. And so there's this sense, and I think that switch is where things get wonky, is where you experience that real group flow that has this collective capacity to solve problems in a way that just mere calculation just doesn't touch. And then you immediately go into how can we scale it up to society, and it's like, well, then you start doing the bureaucracy thing again and you get all sorts of troubles. And so I think the
Dan,
question I'm wanting to ask is, it's what are ways that we can start on the ground in this way? So there's obviously the fire, and as we've talked about, there's just learning to, in conversation with one person, get a little bit more of that reciprocal flow. I'm curious, just other ways that you've thought about in terms of scaling
yeah.
that and starting small.
Well, I think the thing of it is that it requires an experience that is shared rather than just uh, 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 the kinds of conversations that we're used to having tend to be just this information transfer that often is about defending a position or fixing something that's gone awry or just promoting our egos or whatever it is. That kind of conversation doesn't often lend itself to a shared experience. So
Mm,
so anything that winds up being, a shared experience, I've always engaged in like extreme sports. So I used to do a lot of whitewater kayaking and hang gliding, and I would form these pods, and we would travel around, seeking the whitewater. When the water was running, we'd go where the water was, and then we would like work with each other down these river gorges. We'd have a group of 4 or 5 of us, and somebody would scout ahead, and they'd get to
mm,
a rock fence, and they'd either pick a route, or if they couldn't see a route, they'd jump out of their boat and scout on foot, and then they'd come back and they'd get in their boat and they'd demonstrate the route, and everybody else would follow. And we'd kind of rotate the scout.
mm,
And when something went wrong, often a route was a little too sketchy and somebody gets stuck in a hole, get stuck in a recirculating hole. And then we'd all jump out of our boats and get throw ropes and throw the rope in to get the guy out of the hole.
mm,
And it was just, we became this really self-aware organism
mm, mm,
that we developed a way of knowing that often transcended words altogether.
mm,
Um, and we often went hours and hours and hours in close concentration with one another and not speaking, because we're
mm,
in the roar. There's this roar of whitewater all around us and stuff,
mm,
and
mm,
so, so something a little less dramatic is so I've taken up the cause of making my little community more fire resilient. And one of the things that we have needed is a central location of fire hose that's in good shape and some training around using that fire hose. So I just went around to my neighbors and I got 7 of my closest neighbors to pool enough money to buy the hoses and buy the equipment, buy all the stuff we needed to build a shed to store the hose in. And we all just kind of worked together on putting that together.
Mm,
And it's, you know, there's an outcome there that we're kind of keeping in mind, you know, the protecting ourselves and providing ourselves with a first response capacity. You know, once we've discussed that, it's like it's easy to just fall in with one another and get things done. So that's another way that I think it could be any. You know, I grew up in this little town of 43 houses, and I grew up in this little boy tribe that had a lot of freedom. You know, we our parents most of the time did not know what we were doing, and it was this same tribe for like 10 years as a child. And we we just we invented capers that were really complicated and really risky and really fun. And we pulled off a lot of stuff because we had this tribe of people that had different sensibilities, different capabilities for like having a long view. There were a couple kids in that group that had a very long view, and they would kind of run harebrained schemes through their brains before and provide some input. So there was a lot of checks and balances because there was a group of us that had different characters and different sensibilities.
mm,
Um, but it's just
mm,
it's about engaging with other human beings, you know.
yeah. Yeah, as we start to wrap up here, I'm just the sense that I'm sitting with is, I mentioned earlier, like a big part of the podcast is to try to use language in new ways that can help us speak to this stuff. And what I'm really getting and so grateful for you highlighting is the language comes downstream from the experience. Like you actually gotta be it first. And and you gotta, you know, you gotta have shared experiences with other people where you're getting in it together, where you're having community, where you're doing harebrained schemes, where you're where you really there's a sense of of relying on each other, but not in a sense of dependence, but of mutual interconnectedness, where
Faith. It's back to
of
that word
faith.
faith, right?
Mm,
You know?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a way that, you know, this kind of isolated way we've learned to live, we've kind of lost a little bit of faith, and it's hard for us to trust other human beings in the way that's required. You really have
Mm,
to, you know, you back to the thing about words, you know, we talked about how a long time ago words kind of fit fit the scenario. We used them to fit the scenario, and they were much more loosely defined before there were dictionaries. Um, but the thing about that slipperiness of words in a society where it's hard to trust people is that words can be used in ways that just confound people. And so it's really critical to develop trust, in order to have these engagements, to develop a level of trust that you can use words loosely and
yeah.
have faith that people are going to take what you say at face value, and not distort it for other reasons.
I almost want to play with that. Take what you say at faith value. A little cheeky, but um, yeah, yeah. No, I think you're right. And just because both these senses of faith, of in each other, in our own sense of attunement to the land and to ourselves and to each other. Um, yeah, yeah, just really highlighting that sense that it really is more faith, and that, like you said, we're in a really weird spot to be doing that when a lot of the things that we used to have faith in are not showing themselves to be very trustworthy. And so finding the places where we actually can have those refuges of faith is really important. Um, yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the things that happened when our perception of ourselves changed, that was, I think the Enlightenment was kind of the heart, the like that Enlightenment period was when we really got obsessed with that. And what what happened there was essentially our own experience was put in doubt, right?
Mm.
It's like, oh, you mean the sun doesn't actually come up and go down every day? Oh shit, we're fucked. We can't trust what we know through experience. And that just has become intense. It's like we really lost faith that we can do anything without consulting professionals and experts and governments, and I think we really need to start rethinking that, because we do have such an incredible capacity to just wing things and make them work. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's I just really enjoy just living kind of a free form life, and trusting that the people I encounter will be able to get on board with where I'm going, and trust that it'll all work out. And it does. It really, I really think that, you know, having faith in life really kind of promotes success in in a way. And so it's like our whole system, like, so we're all obsessed with insurance, right? And really, insurance, a lot of insurance is just an investment in our own failure, right? It's like I think that we'd be better off investing in our hopes than our fears, on some in some respect, I mean, and again, we need to use some judgment about that, but I think it's gone a little bit too far one way.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, that seems like about as beautiful a place as any to wrap this up. Put put make bets on our hopes and not our failure. I think that's a pretty good um
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Let's go with what we hope and not what
Mm,
we fear.
cool. Well, thank you, man. Anything else you want to leave us off with?
Oh, I really appreciate you providing the opportunity for this conversation. I really like what you're doing, and yeah, let's talk again sometime. We kind of there's a lot of threads that we could follow from this conversation, and yeah, let's do it again anytime. I really enjoy hanging out with you.
Sounds like a plan, man. You too.
See you, Jake.